This is the Tamron 35-150 f2-2.8. Yes, you heard it right. 35-150 f2-2.8. And this is not a review unit, by the way. This is actually my own lens. I bought this with my own money. And I don't usually buy new lenses or cameras right when they come out. I usually watch some reviews and maybe test them myself before I make any big purchases. But when I heard that name, I just had to have it. I just couldn't resist. It is an intriguing lens, of course, because there's really nothing else quite like it on the market right now. The closest thing that I can think of is the Canon RF 28-70 f2, but that lens is much more expensive than this, and this lens has a much longer range. And there's an older version of this lens which used to be f2.8 to f4 instead of the f2-2.8. So that's a pretty big upgrade, I would say. And this lens is $1,900, which is still not cheap, but considering what it can do and what it can potentially replace, I thought it was a pretty good value. At least that's what I told my wife when I bought it. I bought this lens for mainly two reasons: to shoot portraits and events. And I think that's what most people will buy this lens for. What's interesting to me is Tamron is marketing this as a travel lens, which I'm sure it's great for that, but it is quite large and heavy to be carried around all day while traveling. I guess maybe the argument there is that if you have this attached to your camera, maybe you don't have to carry as many other lenses in your bag. And for events, instead of using something like a 24-70 and a 70-200 on two camera bodies, maybe if you don't need that wider end, and maybe if you're shooting at like a medium or smaller size venue and you don't need to go all the way up to 200, then this can cover pretty much everything in between. And if you shoot with Tamron's 28-75 and 70-180, then that's 28-180 versus 35-150, so you're really not going to feel like you're missing out on too much. Or since this lens can cover such a wide range already, maybe you can pair this up with something like a 16-35 or Tamron's 17-28. Or you could go the other way by pairing this up with something longer like the 100-400 or a 150-600, which is actually what I did last week when I was shooting at a sporting event. So this opens up so much more possibilities, and that's basically why I bought this lens. But does it actually live up to its expectations? Am I disappointed in any ways? Should you buy one? We're gonna find out in this video. As usual, let's start with the hardware. And this looks and feels very different from any other current Tamron lenses. With all the buttons and switches on the side, it actually looks a lot like a Sigma lens now. The weight of this is 1,165 grams, which is about 120 grams heavier than the new Sony G Master 70-200. The new one, not the old one. The old one used to be like 1,500 or something. And the size of it is a little bit bigger than the 24-70 G Master. And compared to the Tamron 17-28, you can see how much bigger this thing is. The length of it, without counting the lens caps, is 6.2 inches or about 16 centimeters. And when it gets extended all the way, it gets about 2 inches longer. And the barrel doesn't feel too loose, and it seems to stay in place pretty well. But just for some extra security, there's a lock for that as well. And finally, the zoom ring is back on the correct side of the lens, on the inner end of the lens. But what's interesting is the new Tamron 28-75, the Mark II version, that lens still has the zoom ring at the front. So this was not a global design change in their product lineup. But back on this lens, the zoom ring feels very nice, and the throw is reasonably short considering its range. And the rubber is slightly more raised compared to the older lenses, and I like that very much. But my only complaint about the zoom ring is that it is quite narrow for such a big lens. And compared to the zoom ring on the 17-28, it is even narrower than that. And because the lens is quite front heavy, it even feels smaller than it looks. I think it just would have been really nice if the rubber ring covered a little bit more area. The focus ring also feels very nice. It's not too heavy, not too light. And what's also great about this is that you can customize how the focus ring behaves in the Tamron lens utility software by connecting it through the USB port down here. More on that later. You can make it linear or non-linear. You can change the direction and draw length. And if you don't need it, you can also set it up as the aperture ring, which is pretty cool. On the side, there's the AF on and off switch, which is always nice to have. And there are 3 focus hold buttons, one at the top, one at the side, and the one at the bottom. And there is a custom setting switch. There are 3 settings for that you can use to further customize this lens to your liking. So now this one's a little bit controversial. As you can see, they put the USB port down here on the side, so it does feel a bit exposed. Tamron does claim that this port is waterproof. Yes, proof, not just resistant like on many smartphones nowadays. So I'm not too worried about some dust or water getting in the lens, but at least some cover would have been nice. If some dusts do get in there, or if I drop this lens in the mud or something, it's going to be very, very difficult to clean it out of there. So, but I'm sure there are lots of third-party USB port covers you can buy, so I might get one if I know I'll be shooting in some harsh weather or something. It uses an 82mm filter thread, which is different from any other Tamron zoom lenses, just because this is physically so much larger. And following their tradition, their lens hood is made in Philippines, their front lens cap is made in Vietnam, and the lens and the rear lens cap are made in China, but they made sure to mention that it is still designed in Japan. I wonder if that's like their subtle way of saying how bitter they are about losing in the World War II. It would have been really funny if it came with the USB cable from yet another country, but unfortunately it doesn't come with one, which was kind of funny to me because in the Lens Utility app, it says using a USB cable from other manufacturers may cause accidents or malfunction. Not sure exactly what they mean by accidents, but thankfully, I'm still fine, and the USB cables that I had worked just fine. Overall, everything feels very high quality, more durable, less plasticky than before. I'm very happy with the way this looks and feels. I do wish the zoom ring was a bit wider, and I wish it came with a cover for the USB port and the USB cable, but I don't think any of them are deal breakers in my opinion. Now let's talk about image quality. Well, what can I say about the image quality? First of all, this lens is pretty sharp. I mean, most lenses are sharp nowadays, and this may not even be the sharpest lens that I've tested, but for a lens with such a long range, it's pretty up there. And what I was impressed by was how it performs well consistently throughout the range at any aperture. There's virtually no chromatic aberration. I didn't see it in any of my photos, although I did notice a tiny bit of color fringing in the control test, but probably not enough to see it in any real-world use cases. It also managed flare and maintained contrast well in backlit situations, and overall, a solid performer. However, it does have one weakness though, and that is Cushion Distortion. While shooting from mid to long ranges, around maybe 50 all the way up to 150, there's a clear distortion happening, and it becomes very obvious on photos with any straight lines. It's not the worst I've seen, and usually about 6 to 8 point correction fixes it, but I learned with this lens you have to frame your shots a little wider than usual so the edges have some room to stretch out. One thing you might be curious about is the variable aperture. So it goes from f2 at 35mm, and as soon as you get to about 40 or 45, it goes to 2.2, and it stays there until you get to about 60, and from 60 it goes to 2.5 and all the way up to 85, and from 85 to 150 it's 2.8. So there's a pretty reasonable range where you can shoot above 2.8. And the background blur looks pretty nice either up close at 35 or at 150. This lens has a pretty decent minimum focusing distance as well. It's about 13 inches or 0.33 meters at 35mm, and about 33.5 inches or 0.85 meters at 150. And with that, while having very little focus breathing, you can get some great compression with close range headshots. You know, the visual difference between f2 and 2.8 at 35mm may not be huge, and it may not even be this lens's biggest selling point, at least in the real world usage, but it is definitely nice to have. It does make me kind of wonder though, although I'm not an expert in lens construction, what if this lens was a constant f2.8 aperture lens instead of going from f2 to 2.8? What if this was a 2.8 lens from 35 to 150? Could they have made this lens a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, and maybe a little bit cheaper? I'm not saying it should have been, but just something to think about. And one last thing I wanted to talk about was autofocus. I saved it for last because, well, there's really not much to talk about. And I've tried this lens on an A9 II and an A7R III, and obviously it worked better on the A9 II, but even on the A7R III, which is a pretty old camera now, it still did a great job at keeping up with moving subjects. And whenever I wanted to move the focusing points, it always locked focus onto whatever I wanted it to very quickly. So overall, I'm very happy with the way the lens looks, the way the images look, and the distortion is kind of annoying, but it's also very easy to fix. And I don't have to remind you how useful and convenient this range is. I can shoot a whole portrait session without changing the lens, and I can probably shoot a whole wedding with this one lens, although in most cases I'll pair this up with something like a 16-35. But the point is, it just makes it so much easier to do that compared to when you're shooting with something like a 24-70 or 2 primes. So that's going to be it for me today. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you have any more questions about this lens, just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to them all, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.